in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giuliano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Anu Mandapati. She is the Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Magic Leap. Anu, it's so good to see you. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
That was a long time ago, Christina. So I'm very excited to be here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I think from a very young age, I knew that I wanted to be in a leadership role. So it's always been about impact my entire life. And so I knew I wanted to move into a leadership role to make the most amount of impact I could.
I love that. You fast forward to today, you are a leader, you're continuing to make impact. I would love to know what brought you to Magic Leap and really continue to be a leader, specifically in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure. So Magic Leap, I've always been drawn to organizations focused on innovation, and that's what Magic Leap is all about. And specifically for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I've been in leadership development and DEI roles for pretty much most of my career, and really coming into an organization where I have to say it's not as frequent probably for a lot of my peers who've shared with me, but it's challenging to find an organization where you've got your CEO and your chief people officer as well, who is just so 100% supportive of DEI and willing to do what we need to do to really move the needle and make an impact in this space. So that's why I'm thrilled to be in this role.
Absolutely. I think that it is so important to have folks on board, especially executives, senior leaders, your CEO as well. And we see a lot of organizations really leaning into this work, which is great. I would love to know from your perspective and experience working with organizations, what is the role of really private employers to make the world at large more equitable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to say organizations in general, whether they're private or public. So, looking at where we are today, there are a lot of human rights that are being stripped. And really, organizations at this point have to make a decision. Who are they? Who do they want to be? And what do they really want to stand for? And so if you look at from prospective employees to, current employees that, organizations might have, and even consumers when you're thinking about brands, if you look at all of the data, all of it points to people want to know what an organization is doing to be equitable, be more diverse, be more inclusive. What are the steps that they're actually taking for the people there as well as externally? So I think at this point, organizations have to be doing something, and not in a performative way, in a way that's actually making meaningful impact. As we see more and more transparency reports, we're seeing the data. And so we're seeing where they were and where they are now, and what are their plans to continue making an impact in this space.
Absolutely. Those are good questions to really ask both on an internal side for the employees and then for consumers, for customers, for those clients. And when we're talking about kind of answering those questions for who we are as an organization, what do we stand for, a lot of those questions are answered by leaders, both formal and informal at a company. How do you really define leadership at an organization?
That is a good question. So I'd say kind of a general definition is leadership is always about just influencing others to take some type of action. And I think leaders of today, it's really about representing, elevating, and leading everyone in the organization and not just some. And so a lot of the challenges that we've seen are, leaders tend to make, I won't say tend to, but many leaders are making decisions where whether they acknowledge it or not or realize it or not, they're actually favoring some individuals over another. So who are you assigning stretch assignments to? Who are you promoting? Who are you hiring? So it's really about looking at any bias that is showing up in those areas, and how do you disrupt them? And that way you're actually becoming a leader for all people and not just some, because you're leading everyone. You're really thinking about how do I elevate everyone? How do I advocate for everyone?
Yeah, and I was talking to someone about this the other day in terms of those moments of promotion and succession planning, and when you're building an onboarding program, really thinking about, okay, how am I leading? Really asking yourselves those questions, really checking in on the conscious or unconscious bias there too. And I know that we were talking about as well. Some organizations have that leadership development program. What does going beyond that really look like in practice?
I think the challenge, right? And it comes from a time perspective. Everybody wants to offer some form of leadership development training. And the challenge with those is if it's a one and done, the learning doesn't stick. So I very much employ a learn, amplify, and sustain model. So if we are focusing on building a leadership development program to, meet the needs of leaders at that point, that's fantastic. But that fits into the learn piece of it. But what are we doing to make that learning stick? So it's figuring out how do we amplify that learning? And a big piece of that is practicing. So how are we practicing those behaviors that we just learned in a psychologically safe space? So you're doing it, whether it's through, cohort groups and through, practice and breakouts in that kind of a way. And then what do you do, when it's 3 months out, 6 months out? So continuing to have that accountability and that support to really share what's working, what's not. So I would go from, the learn piece of it, the leadership development experience, to amplifying that learning. So it could be through whatever ways that the group can actually practice those behaviors, to sustaining too. And a big piece of that is, where do most of us spend a majority of our time? It's on our teams. So whatever we want to create, how do we hold each other accountable as a team? How do we support one another? And so these are just a few examples, but it's very much thinking about 3 months out, 6 months out, a year out, how do we make this learning stick? So if we're not employing an amplify and sustain parts of the learning, it's not going to be as impactful.
Yeah, and I think that has to do a lot with accountability, as you were talking about your commitment and really putting into practice what you learn on a day-to-day basis. It's one thing to go through module 1, 2, and 3, and then when you apply it to situations and opportunities, how are you really thinking critically about this as well? A part of it is that internal reflection, asking yourselves these questions. And then another piece is really thinking about cohorts, as you were mentioning, and also mentors, sponsors. I know some people call it their personal board of directors as well, to really reflect back and give folks feedback as well. In terms of that relationship, what's the difference between a mentor and a sponsor?
Sure. So mentors are individuals who likely experience the situation that you're in. So they're able to guide you of how to navigate that situation. And sponsors can be mentors, but it's an elevated role. It's really about people whose voice carries weight. They are in the right rooms with the right people, having those conversations. And so they are advocating for you. And so the sponsorship is a much more elevated advocacy role than a mentor would be. And I think it's very important for everyone to really, if you want to increase your visibility, it's really about, finding that network of sponsors, building those relationships, and finding a way to maintain those relationships so they're able to advocate for you, because otherwise you might not have that visibility. And so that's why I think it's very important to, anytime we're doing back to leadership development programs, there's a sponsorship component to it too. Your leader can't always be your advocate, and in many situations may not be. And what I mean by that is, they're advocating for you in the day to day, but they might not be at the levels or in the rooms having those conversations where that visibility is really needed. And so it's really important to have those sponsors outside of your immediate leader as well.
Yeah, and it's important to have those different levels of relationships and also define what we mean by that as well, and really advocate for yourself and cultivate those relationships in an intentional way. I know you mentioned your framework earlier around learn, amplify, sustain, and I would love if you could dig a little bit further into what that means, and if you could share a specific example with folks who are listening.
Sure. So if you take an inclusive leadership training, for example, so we're really wanting leaders to practice more inclusive behaviors. And so they're going through some form of a workshop or a series of workshops, learning, what those behaviors are. So that would be the learn component. And then the amplify component is really either having an accountability partner, or it could be a cohort group, for example, who's actually going through this series of workshops. And so you're actually partnering and saying, here's what's challenging for me, here's what's actually a strength of mine, here's where I need support and accountability, and how. And so you're able to actually practice those behaviors. So you're amplifying what it is that you're learning. And that sustainment piece can show up in a variety of ways. So if leaders are going through inclusive leadership training, for example, then that sustainment piece is actually bringing their teams together and having a conversation about who do we want to be as a team, how do we actually want to co-create an inclusive culture, so everyone is sharing what they're going to do, because it's a shared responsibility, it's co-creation. So everyone is sharing how they're going to contribute to that goal, what are my challenges, and here's how we can all hold each other accountable. So the point of this is to keep it in kind of front and center. It can't be kind of going off to the wayside. It's really about making sure that we're embedding these behaviors, integrating them into day-to-day practices. And the more that you're doing that, you actually move from kind of a conscious competence of being aware of what it is that you're doing and then trying to improve upon it, to an unconscious competence, because you're not even thinking about it. It's natural for you to be more inclusive in a variety of ways. And so that's what the goal is, for it to become natural. And the more that you practice, that's actually where the progress comes from. We're not looking for perfection. It's just more practice.
Absolutely. It's similar to that muscle memory. When you are at the gym as well, you need to practice and really think about these things. And then it becomes second nature as well to you too. And you mentioned a couple examples of accountability. And this is something that we talk about all the time in terms of one person, one team is not accountable to make an entire organization feel like they belong. It's everybody's responsibility. What have you seen be effective in terms of accountability and ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion is at the DNA of every organization? For example, some executives' pay and compensation is related to specific goals at some companies.
I think the more specific that we can get and the clarity of so one, I would say tied in with your values. DEI can't be something separate, off to the side again. It has to be embedded into the DNA of an organization. So one, how are we actually embedding that? And a great way to do that is connect that to the organizational values so people understand why and how this is important. And then if you look at competencies, when we look at performance evaluations and how we're actually getting evaluated, these reviews, it should be really clear to all employees about what those expectations are. So I'm going to use the phrase leadership competencies. Everybody, is a leader regardless of what their title is. So it's really about how do you want to lead, and what is the organization expecting at different levels, whether you are a leader of a team, you're a leader of many other people leaders, if you're leading the entire organization. So I think that is very important to make sure that where that inclusive leadership falls based on different roles. And even what you shared about when DEI outcomes are tied to leadership compensation, so that definitely moves the needle. But it's not just about something about being forced to do something. It's really about involving people along on this journey. And so it's a shared responsibility. Inclusion does not go to, that responsibility isn't a chief diversity officer or a CEO or a chief people officer. It's everyone's responsibility. And one of the things I talk about a lot is there's some organizations that believe in being a culture carrier. And what that means is one person sets the culture and then other people carry it. So it's not something that's necessarily a shared responsibility. It's just because someone else is doing it. If we are culture co-creators, we have skin in the game. My actions make an impact. Your actions make an impact. So there's more of that shared responsibility, and that way we're all responsible for co-creating that culture together. And I think that mentality, that approach, that mindset makes a significant difference. So it's not a few people, it's all of us and how we contribute.
That shared responsibility. I love the term co-creation as well. And when we're talking about leadership, those leadership competencies and common trends we see with really effective leaders, especially over the past few years, really leading with empathy. And I want to ask, how do you coach executives to lead with humility and vulnerability? Sometimes I hear on other podcasts and with leaders too, does that mean I have to change my entire personality and be vulnerable all the time? And that's how we're saying. So I want to ask your opinion on really coaching executives to lead with these characteristics.
Yeah, so I'm also an executive and team coach. And I think a big piece of this, especially in the last few years, we've seen a shift clearly, especially with the pandemic. You're seeing people and their personal lives, whether it's dogs, babies, whatever it might be, people's faces too. And I think there's been a transition, a paradigm shift from before. There is, I'd say, still the sense of I need to be perfect. I need to be strong as a leader. I need to show people, kind of like I'm invincible and I'm so strong. And there's been a paradigm shift for quite some time now, and it's getting, it's getting more and more and more of this need to show a little bit more about yourself, the humanness, because when we show that humanness and a little bit of vulnerability, it's actually other people are feeling much more psychologically safe with us, because then you're giving them permission to showcase their vulnerability, showcase a little bit more about their personal life as well. And so as far as the comfort level and the amount of vulnerability, it's not about spilling your deepest, darkest secrets. It's just showing your humanness. It's showing how you are as a leader, the personal life, the professional life, all of it actually does meld together. We're not compartmentalized as much as sometimes people try to be. Our personal life affects our professional life. Our professional life impacts our personal life. And so there's a bit more here of, if I showcase a little bit of that, people are understanding that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay not to be so perfect. It's okay to ask for what we need. And I think a lot of that has shifted, especially, with COVID, with the pandemic in the last few years, where people are becoming more humble. They're showing more humility. They're showing more vulnerability, and you're seeing the impact on their teams as well. It's a positive impact.
Yeah, I think it's definitely different when you say, okay, it's okay to make mistakes here. We definitely embrace that in the company culture. But if nobody, especially leaders, are sharing kind of mistakes they've made as well, it is really different. And that modeling behavior is so, so important. In your experience, and especially with the conversations that we're having today, are there any buzzwords or phrases you're really tired of hearing in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I wouldn't say buzzwords is what the challenge is. I think for me, it's very much, if you look at diversity, equity, inclusion training, it is an $8 billion industry. And so the challenge that I have is, how are we actually making an impact? Because what most organizations doing, it isn't sticking, it isn't working, it isn't actually having the impact that we want to have. So when it comes to being more impactful, what is it that we're doing? Are we actually focusing on a learn, amplify, sustain model to make the learning stick? Are we actually letting people know that it's, how important it is to, of inclusion for the organization? Are we actually tackling root causes of problems versus just putting band-aids on things? Earlier, we were talking about leadership development programs, and I'd say a variety of organizations at this point, they want to diversify their leadership pools. And so maybe there is a leadership development program, and that's actually, I would say, a band-aid to the problem. And because is a leadership development program, is it beneficial and impactful? Absolutely. I think we can all benefit from developing and building in that area. But the challenge is, if we look at, what's prohibiting people from moving up, it's typically nothing to do with their leadership skills. It's actually about visibility. So how do we actually integrate that sponsorship program to make sure that people are building relationships and they've got those advocates to increase the visibility in front of the right rooms and the right people? And then the other piece of it is, how are we actually working with leaders who have those decision-making power, whether it become, related to hiring, whether it's related to promotions, or even offering those stretch assignments to get visibility? How do we disrupt that bias? Because so many times people are placing others in this, in these situations of promotions or, stretch assignments of people who look like them, who speak like them, who act like them. There's a similarity bias that's coming in there. So if we don't disrupt that, and we start to really help people build relationships and increase exposure to other people, we're not going to actually make the effort. So for me, it's not about buzzwords. It's, what are we doing to actually move the needle and make an impact? Because as you look around for a lot of organizations, organizations aren't actually moving the needle. I mean, the numbers are kind of the same for a lot of organizations. When you look at talent attraction, you look at retention. What are people really doing, leaders in organizations, to take the necessary actions to make the impact that's needed?
Are your words, actions, commitments, results really lining up with what you say they are and what the ideal impact you would like to create within your organization as well? And if they're not, or if they are, what's working? What do you need to double down on? What needs to be improved on too? And really have that holistic and strategic lens instead of, looking to check a box or looking to make sure we have X, Y, and Z, but really manifesting that it is something that is sustainable for the next few years and something it could build a healthy foundation on. And is there anything that I didn't ask throughout our conversation that you would like to highlight, or underscoring any key insights about leadership development competencies, or anything really we talked about on our conversation today?
I would just highlight the practice piece. I think, when people hear diversity, equity, and inclusion or inclusive leadership, sometimes there's a little bit of a heaviness tied to that of I've got to get it perfect. It's not about perfection. We toss that out. Perfection causes stress and anxiety, and that's not what this is about. So it's really about practice. The more that we practice these behaviors and we increase our exposure, we, consistently take action, we are not only increasing our awareness, but we're getting more comfortable. We're becoming more confident because just like anything else, just like you said, if you're in the gym, right, and you've never lifted weights, you do a little bit more, and it starts to build and that muscle grows. And this is exactly what this is. So practice is what is actually going to lead to progress, and we can just toss perfection out.
Practice, practice, practice. Really lean in. Don't be intimidated. And also, really, you have to take that step as well. You can do a lot of different things, but really practicing and incorporating those strategies into your day to day is so important. That mindset, the lens. Anu, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as a reminder, folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.